I just saw this the other day. Obviously, I prefer Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to Joe Biden, right? If I had a choice, I would honestly prefer RFK because he wants to do things like wind down the proxy war in Ukraine, and he's doing other good, or he's got other good positions too. He's critical of big pharma, blah blah blah. But his takes about Israel have been absurd. They've been ridiculous, and he even jumped in on the smear campaign led by the bourgeois media against in the Zionist sections of the bourgeois media against Roger Waters, the lead singer of Pink Floyd, for literally just performing a song that they were offended by because it pointed out that Israel is an apartheid state, or it was a piece of artwork criticizing Nazi Germany where Roger Waters at one point dresses up like a Nazi, and they completely ignored the context. They completely ignored the actual message of his art. So they could say, he's dressed like a Nazi. He's a Nazi. Look, he hates Jewish people and he criticizes Israel. He's anti-Semitic. And RFK went right along with it because he's a hardcore Zionist himself. And, you know, when you hear him talk about Israel, his takes are indistinguishable from, I don't know, those people that Abby Martin interviews in Gaza Fights for Freedom, where she interviews all the Israeli citizens who are talking about how they need to get rid of the Arabs and all this racist BS. It's like RFK is like one step down from that. Here's his interview with Glenn Greenwald from 2 months ago.
Let me ask you about a recent controversy in which you found yourself, more as a window to understand some of your broader views, which was the praise you originally offered for Roger Waters with regard to his stance on both Ukraine, which he is opposed to in terms of the U.S. proxy war, as well as COVID. He was questioning a lot of the same orthodoxies you were. And then you ended up deleting that tweet where you praised him and made clear that the reason was because he had held views on Israel.
So he liked Roger Waters. And then a bunch of his staffers or a bunch of the Democrats around him said, no, he's one of the bad guys. You can't like him. You can't like him. He criticizes the Israeli apartheid state that's forced 75% of Palestinian people into refugee status.
Palestine that you didn't share. I want to ask you about the specific kind of divergencies that you have with him on that question. But before I get into that, why was it necessary for you to delete your praise for Roger Waters just because you disagree with him on Israel? Can't you praise him on Ukraine and COVID and then at the same time say, but there are other issues, including Israel, where I have differences? Why did you delete the praise entirely?
Well,
because he's a cuck.
First of all, the reasons that I praised him was because of his position on the war, his position on COVID, which I thought was very courageous at a time when nobody, and also his position on Julian Assange.
Right.
I disagree, I would say fiercely, with his criticism of Israel. And I'm not, there are enough people who characterize those political differences anti-Semitic that me endorsing him felt like I was buying into that, into something that was abhorrent to me.
Hear that? You catch that? It wasn't Roger Waters was saying something anti-Semitic, or Roger Waters did something anti-Semitic, or Roger Waters showed himself to be an anti-Semite. No. He said too many people around me accused Roger Waters of being anti-Semitic, said Roger Waters was anti-Semitic, so I bought into it. Well, buddy, RFK, that's what they do to every critic of the Israeli apartheid state, dude. That's what they did to Jeremy Corbyn. They tried doing it to Bernie Sanders. There were articles calling Bernie Sanders an anti-Semite. He is a Jewish man who had relatives who were exterminated in the Holocaust. And they tried calling him an anti-Semite because he criticized the apartheid state of Israel and said that the Palestinian people deserve very basic human rights, which they are systematically being deprived of by this Israeli apartheid state that gets over $3 billion a year from the U.S. that you're praising right now, that you're saying, you're really up in arms about their right to exist and their right to continue to enforce this apartheid on the people of Palestine. So he just fell for it. It's not that he said it right there. There were too many people around me calling Roger Waters an anti-Semite. So what? You just believed them? So you went along with the mob?
I really disagree with I think Roger, like many critics of it, first of all, people who criticize Israeli policy should not be characterized as anti-Semitic. But people who apply a different standard to judging Israel than they would to judging an Arab country.
So he has to support U.S. regime change efforts in Iran, right? He has to repeat the lie that Iran has nuclear weapons or they're enriching uranium to create nuclear weapons, when under the Iran deal, we were the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, was monitoring Iran's nuclear program 24/7 and never at any point said was there any evidence that Iran was creating a nuclear weapon. And the only reason that Iran enriches uranium is for medical isotopes for their very impressive healthcare system. Right there, we have to say Iran is worse than Israel. Otherwise, you're not allowed to criticize Israel, right? Well, Iran's not an apartheid state, right? You could criticize Iran, right? Iran's not a socialist republic. They're highly anti-imperialist in their foreign policy, and the vast majority of their economy is state-owned, not owned by Western multinationals. So they're a very interesting country, But I have, of course, criticisms of Iran. But they're not an apartheid state. They're not a U.S.-backed neo-colonial outpost that's forced 75% of Palestinian people into refugee status like Israel is. Right? So you're basically saying you have to condemn Bashar al-Assad and Khomeini in Iran and all of the U.S.'s enemies in that region if you want to criticize Israel. Ridiculous. No, the U.S. is targeting those countries with regime change efforts right now. So if Roger Waters were to focus all of his analysis on how bad Iran is, that would just be helping the U.S. with their propaganda campaign to take out Iran. Not saying you can't criticize Iran, right? But understand the context and the situation that you're in as an American or as a British citizen.
I think then that you've crossed a line there. And I do think that Roger does that.
Crossed the line. Sounds a lot like Crystal Ball when she said that him criticizing the COVID vaccine was a red line and, showed why she needed to support Biden. Apparently funding neo-Nazis in Ukraine wasn't a red line for Crystal Ball. But now RFK pulling out the same thing. That's a red line. Criticizing apartheid, literal apartheid, is a red line for you, RFK? It doesn't make any sense, dog.
Did some of his stuff, and I think, like I said, I do not think people who criticize that people who criticize.
I've never seen him this flustered either. I've never seen him stumble over his words this bad. Like, he clearly does not have a great grasp on what he's talking about. And now this issue is being shoved into the mainstream because so many people were upset at his heinous criticisms of Roger Waters and his ridiculous position on Israel. And I don't think he knows how to handle it. I've never seen him look this flustered or stutter that much.
Israel policies should not be called anti-Semitic, but I do think that many people are applying, or Israel's critics are applying, a double standard.
So just to be clear, when you were interviewed by Crystal Ball on Breaking Points, it became kind of a very talked about interview, particularly the part where she was disagreeing with you about your view on vaccines. We did a segment on this show talking about that interview, and my main critique with her, she's a friend of mine, was that I didn't have a problem with her disagreeing with your views on vaccines. Lots of people do. She described it, though, as a red line, which seemed to me her way of saying, I don't disagree with you here, but you're so far beyond the pale about an issue that I regard as so sacred that the fact that I disagree with you here means you're basically off limits. Like, you're radioactive. You're not susceptible to consideration for support no matter what, in a way that, say, Joe Biden wouldn't be. That's the impression I got when you didn't just disagree with Roger Waters on Israel, but deleted the praise. Namely, it doesn't matter how much I agree with him. I regard him as a person who's so radioactive that he should never be praised under any circumstances because of his view on Israel. That's a red line for me. Is that essentially what motivated your deletion and how you view people like Roger Waters and those who share his views on Israel?
No, not at all. In fact, I continue to admire Roger Waters for his positions on, for his courageous positions on Ukraine, on Julian Assange, on COVID. But because of that issue is so sensitive and radioactive, people, I did not want to leave any opportunity for people to misunderstand. Since apparently, I guess, as I understand it now, he's more well known for his anti-Israel position than probably any other position. And so me praising him without making really clear what I was praising him for, and that I did not buy into his other stuff, was a source of confusion to people that I did not want to leave up there.
Fair enough. I mean, I think the reason why he's most known for that is sometimes the same reason you're most known for your views on vaccines, even though you have views on lots of other things, which is because a lot of times people look for ways to take establishment critics and kind of render them radioactive by focusing on the one issue they know people will be most hostile to. But let me ask you about the substance of the Israel position. You alluded to the fact that your family had long been supporters of Israel. That was kind of the standard Democratic Party position for a long time, still is. At the same time, Israel has clearly changed over the years. The demographic shifts in the population have made it a much more religious society, more right-wing society. And I think any honest observer in the region or anywhere acknowledges that a two-state solution, the kind of way that people justify defending Israel, is now essentially impossible. There's way too many settlements in the West Bank, and those people are never moving, those settlers. You need a civil war between the government and Israel to do it. From the position of someone who's running for U.S. president, would your view be that the U.S. should continue?
I think RFK might be shitting himself right now. Glenn Greenwald's just dropping knowledge bombs on him.
To provide billions of dollars every year in aid to Israel unconditionally, meaning no matter how they treat the Palestinians, no matter what it is that they become politically, or would you condition that aid on them treating the Palestinians more humanely and more fairly?
Yeah, I mean, that's a long and complex question. And I've been to Israel. I've visited specifically Palestinian settlements within Israel and in...
Dude, I can't stand the politicians speak. I've been to Israel. Okay. Have you been to Gaza? All right, he said he's been to the settlements. How many Palestinian people under occupation have you talked to? Because if you knew them, or if you watched Abby Martin's Gaza Fights for Freedom, or if you talked to the kind of people she talked to, I doubt you'd be saying these things. So save me the politician speech of, well, I've been there, and here's the thing, it's really complex. Give me a straight answer.
However you want to call it, West Bank or Judea and Samaria. I've been visited, I've spoken with government officials there. I understand that that Palestinians are mistreated in Israel. I've seen, the water allocations that were very, very unfairly allocated to the new settlements rather than to traditional settlements that have been around in some cases for hundreds of years. In terms of the evolution, I think everything has a historical context in Israel. And if you look at why we don't have a two-state solution in Israel, which everybody now says they want, but both in 1947 and 1947, 1948, and then again in 2001, it was the Palestinian leadership that walked away from a two-state solution and pledged itself to the destruction of Jewish people. Oh, and that's a very, very clear history. And I think at a time when they have...
It's a very clear history. It's the Palestinians' fault that they couldn't get a two-state solution. Oh, you mean they didn't want the solutions that the Israeli government and that the U.S. were proposing, where more and more and more and more of their land gets taken away every year? Crazy. They didn't want a two-state solution that gave the U.S. and Israel everything they wanted. This is like when Trump came out with his, this is my solution to ending the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it was just another map of Israel-Palestine where there was less Palestinian territory. Like, oh, yes, this will solve the problem. Just give more of their land to Israel. Genius, Trump. Genius, RFK. Just let Israel and the U.S. completely negotiate the so-called two-state solution. Like, dude, that Glenn Greenwald just explained to you why the two-state solution can't work anymore. If it's negotiated by the U.S. and Israel, they're just going to hand themselves more land. The Zionist far-right extremist ideology is totally in control of the Israeli politics and the Israeli government. And they're moving to more and more openly and blatantly far right and extremist every year. You know, they're not going to bargain in good faith with the Palestinian people who don't have military power and who don't get $3 billion plus a year from the U.S. And they've been seizing more and more and more and more land every year. So how are you going to say it's the Palestinians' fault for not agreeing to a so-called two-state solution with this country that keeps seizing more and more of their land through the process of settler colonialism, through literally kicking people out of their homes? Like, dude, you do not know. Oh my, what a screenshot. He definitely just pooped himself.
Very, very generous solution on the table. Now, the other thing I say is Israel is a democracy.
RFK won't debate Max. Of course not.
Just like,
I mean, look at how it went when he debated Glenn Greenwald. He doesn't want to debate someone who's super, super, super educated about this issue. He just wants to take the mainline liberal line on this issue and not get attacked by people in the Democratic Party and not get attacked by AIPAC and the Zionist lobby.
Democracy, just like the United States. But if I was a dissident Arab Palestinian, would I rather be a dissident in Israel or in Saudi Arabia or Oman or Qatar or any other Arab nation? If you're a dissident, you get up in the middle of the public square and denounce the government. Where would you rather be? You'd rather be in Israel.
No, you wouldn't. Yes, obviously I have huge criticisms of Saudi Arabia and those other countries. And it's a very similar situation in Saudi Arabia. Not totally, they have a lot of their own oil wealth, but they're a U.S.-backed country that allows the U.S. to have a neo-colonial outpost in the Middle East, right? But it's not an apartheid state. It's not an apartheid state where the people are literally deprived of their basic human rights because of their ethnicity or because of what they're born as, because they're Palestinian, because of their nationality. That is what's going on in Israel. If you're an Arab, if you're Palestinian, you do not get the same rights as Israelis. And, hundreds of them are being killed every year by the Israeli security forces as they, the settlers continue to take more and more and more of the Palestinians' land. Right? So he's just trying to divert people's anger towards Arabs. He's saying you can't be mad at Israel. They're white people. They're a democracy. Be mad at these Arabs. Saudi Arabia bad too. Yeah, they are. They're doing, what you could classify as a genocide in Yemen, or they were until China brokered peace. Shout out to China. But they're not an apartheid state. They're not an open apartheid state. They're not a neo-colonial settler colonial project getting billions of U.S. tax dollars a year. Right? This is Amnesty International, not a super communist or super socialist or super anti-Western organization. In fact, they've been criticized many times for just kind of backing up what the U.S. government says. But even they recognize Israel's an apartheid state. The United Nations, Israel's 55-year occupation of Palestinian is apartheid, UN human rights expert. Right? So we're not allowed to criticize apartheid. This is the only country in the world where there's an open apartheid going on being funded by the U.S. So quit bringing up Saudi Arabia. Quit bringing up Oman. That's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about Israel and what's going on with the apartheid there, which you're doing apologetics for right now, RFK. He pooped himself again.
The only place you're not going to get in trouble. And that does not mean that it's a perfect democracy. It isn't. It's very, very flawed. And I do not, I differ vociferously with the views of the right-wing, religious right-wing groups that have, in many ways, been dictating politics in Israel over the last few years. I think part of the responsibility of the United States is to try to find a path to justice for the Palestinians. But on all these issues, if you live in any of these other countries and you're gay, for example, you can be killed for that. Israel is the only place where you.
Woke imperialism. Woke imperialism. We have to support the Israeli apartheid state because of their LGBTQ values. That is woke imperialism to a T. Thank you for providing that example, RFK. If I ever teach a class on the way that progressive values and the way that so-called woke values are used to get people to support the most heinous, murderous, evil imperialist projects on Earth, I'll cut out that clip right there and use it for the class.
Freedom. If you're a transvestite, if you have other kind of dissident views, you'd much rather be in Israel than any other place.
I get that argument, but go ahead. You can finish. Right? Well, I just wanted to ask you.
No, Israel.
Where would you rather be if you were a child seeking trauma care in your home? Because in 2021, there were over 60 children killed by Israeli airstrikes. Those are paid for by our tax dollars, and RFK would continue that if, hypothetically, he were to be elected president. And, somehow, because Biden is such a terrible imperialist, RFK would still be a lot better than Biden on a lot of these issues. But yeah, and 11 of those children who were killed were seeking trauma care in their homes to get therapy for the last time that they were hit by a missile. And as they were seeking therapy for the last missile that Israel launched at them, Israel launched another missile at them and killed all 11 of them. But we're not allowed to criticize this because Saudi Arabia is a dictatorship too.
And we need to have the same standard for judging Israel as we judge other Arab countries. We should, and Israel.
You need to have the same standard, dog. You need to have the same standard. You just give Israel a pass. Yeah, they're dropping bombs on 4-year-old children with our tax dollars, but hey, at least you can be gay.
Israel is going into the West Bank and killing children. Is never doing that deliberately. Never. And nobody has ever said it is.
Israel's never, ever doing that deliberately. Ever. They killed 60 children on accident. They stole the Palestinians' homes on accident. They tripped and fell and accidentally took more and more and more of the Palestinian land every single year. It's not a neo-colonial project with the deliberate intent of seizing more land and giving the U.S. a neo-colonial outpost in the region. It's not an overt settler colonial project. They tripped and fell and accidentally took all the Palestinian land and started massacring their children every year. This is...
A lot of people have said it is.
Let me just ask you, up, RFK. Shut up. You're saying so many words without saying anything important or giving us any useful facts, and you're not allowing someone who actually knows what they're talking about in this situation, Glenn Greenwald, to push back at all, because you're wrong and he's going to destroy your argument. Can it? We've heard enough from you.
I want to focus
in all of those other countries, it is the deliberate...
Shut him down, Glenn. Shut this dude up. He's been rambling for like 8 minutes.
Policy of those countries to attack and target civilians and to kill them.
Okay, so let me I just want to focus the question though, because you have the kind of abstract question that you're talking about, which is who's better, Israel or Saudi Arabia? And I don't think anybody would doubt you'd rather live in Israel than Saudi Arabia if that's the choice. Just like people say, I'd rather live in Ukraine than Russia. Ukraine seems more democratic to me than Russia. But when it comes to Ukraine, I've heard you making the argument that even though Ukraine might be our ally, even though they might be more democratic than Russia, we have so many people that you speak eloquently about suffering here at home that this is a war we can't afford. So if you were to go around the United States, as you're already doing and will continue to do, and the question is not who's better, the Israeli or the Palestinians, the question is why are we in the United States transferring billions of dollars of aid each year to a country, Israel, whose citizens in a lot of ways enjoy better standards of living than a lot of the ways American citizens live? What is your argument for why we should send so much money to Israel but not to Ukraine?
Well,
it should compare, rather than compare what it's like to be an Israeli citizen or what it's like to be a Zionist living in Israel compared to Saudi Arabia, or a gay person living in Israel versus Saudi Arabia. They should ask what it's like being a Palestinian person living in the West Bank, right? Or living in Gaza compared to Saudi Arabia. That's a more accurate comparison. There's really not many places in the world where, it's more dangerous than Gaza, or where being born there, you're born into a situation where 75% of your people have already been pushed off their land, are in refugee status, and you're basically in an open air prison. You don't have rights simply because you're an Arab person, because you're Palestinian, right? Being born there is one of the worst or the most unfortunate places to be born in the entire world. But he's saying, well, the Zionists in Israel have it better than gay people in Saudi Arabia. Like, okay, So that means we should keep funding an apartheid state? That makes a lot of sense.
I mean, historically, that argument has been that Israel is the model democracy in the Mideast. It's the only democracy in the Mideast, and as a democracy, it's a model for peacekeeping.
So he's literally falling back on imperialist buzzwords. They're the only democracy in the Middle East. That's not an answer to his question, big dog. That doesn't mean anything. That's not a fact. That's conjecture. That's just you saying that. And democracy and freedom for those of us who are media literate, which you should be, RFK, you know that's just what they say whenever they want to do a fucking regime change intervention. Oh, they're not a democracy. There's no freedom. We need to bring them democracy and freedom. And then, by installing the Pinochet dictatorship or whatever.
And there's never been a time in history when a democracy has gone to war with another democracy. So I think our policy in the United States should be to support the growth of democracies around the world.
That was the argument for going into invading Iraq. We're going to spread democracy in the Middle East. That's the argument for supporting the Ukrainians, which is the Ukrainians are a democracy and Russia's an autocracy.
And Glenn, I agree with you. And
Glenn, I agree with you. You just totally destroyed my entire argument in like 10 seconds, but I agree. It's just that I don't agree, and I think we should continue funding apartheid.
I do think there's a difference between what we did in Iraq, which is imposing a U.S. system, which I don't think was really democracy at the point of a gun, and going in.
How is the Israeli system democracy? How is a system where Arab people are systematically deprived of their rights and where the Israeli security forces, who are armed to the teeth by the U.S., are allowed to kill civilians and even journalists like Shireen Abu Akleh, rest in peace, with impunity? How is that a democracy? Right? Explain how it's a democracy. Explain how their governmental system is controlled by the people in that region. Because I think about every Palestinian person living in that region would say you're full of shit if you tried telling them that. As would the UN, as would Amnesty International, as would any human rights organization that has looked at the case for apartheid in Israel.
Preemptive war, which we've never done in our history, on a pretext in which we lied to the American public about weapons of mass destruction and our policy of assisting an existing democracy in the Mideast that has had a long relationship with our country and long and supportive relationship.
The Palestinians have no say about what happens to them except for getting armed and fighting back, right? Like the armed struggle is like their only path forward at this point, or leaving, right? Or just leaving the region, which is what 75% of them have done, which is what probably the Zionists would like, so they could just take all that region. But then that's when people like RFK say, oh, the Palestinians are just a bunch of terrorists because they're fighting back against the U.S.-backed neo-colonial regime that's stolen all their land for 70 years.
With our country. But, I think you raised some important points. I think it probably, at this point in history, Israel is much better able to take care of itself than it was in the past, and we need to look at all those things.
You need to look at all those things. You raised some interesting points, he says, as in you destroyed my total argument. So, I think RFK honestly has a lot of good positions, and I am grateful for a lot of the things that he said about COVID and about big pharma, because a lot of leftists just started when COVID started, they just started parroting and accepting big pharma propaganda and attacking anybody who was even a little bit critical of big pharma. They're like, you're anti-vax, you're watching Joe Rogan, ivermectin, blah, blah, blah. And, it's like, we're communists, we're socialists. We need to be critical of big pharma, guys. We can't just accept everything they say because there's a pandemic. So I like some of that stuff, and I love that he's criticizing the war in Ukraine. But the hypocrisy on a lot of these issues are just out of control. And I mean, the fact that he got destroyed by Glenn Greenwald there and he still didn't change
I wish I could.
His position is like, come on, are you an honest actor or not, bruh? So This is a short that I just happened to see today. So this is from The Only Democracy in the Middle East, folks. RFK's favorite Middle East democracy.
I was shocked to find out that Israel's techno-dystopia is testing out remote-controlled guns with AI tracking systems on civilians in the West Bank. They've just installed one in Haida refugee camp pointing directly at the entrance to the Palestinian neighborhood. The same spot where an Israeli sniper shot dead a 13-year-old boy and regularly fires at kids. I guess Israel's massive wall, armored military jeeps, snipers, foot soldiers, and 6 watchtowers surrounding the area just wasn't enough defense against the scary Palestinian kids with rocks.
It's not. See, what you don't understand, narrator, is that these kids, when they throw rocks, they're throwing rocks at democracy. They're throwing rocks at the heart of democracy. And these Israeli security forces with the guns targeting Arabs and setting up surveillance and AI-powered machine guns, okay, they're fighting for democracy. They're machine gunning their constituents and their citizens for democracy. So that's what you don't understand. I mean, look at like the Palestinian neighborhoods are literally crawling with Israeli security forces. Right? There's cameras and literal AI machine guns and watchtowers and walls dividing the Zionists with the Arabs and with the Palestinians. Is that what you call democracy, RFK? Come on. You're smarter than this, big dog. And you're going to attack Roger Waters for being against this? You're attacking Roger Waters because he's against this. Doesn't make sense, bro. Doesn't make sense. Quit being a coward. Pull your head out of your ass.